Alright guys, so this is going to be the first lecture of our World War II course. Pardon me, I'm probably going to be coughing every now and again. Again, I'm still shaking the cough from hell. And if we want to look at what causes the Second World War, okay, if we need to go all the way back, realistically we need to go all the way back to the First World War, because it's in the hell of the trenches that World War II really begins. Because World War One, happens because of all of these complex, long-standing problems that will let you take a World War One in modern European culture class or something like that. Let me adjust the camera a little bit. There we go. By the way, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Every time I do this in my hand like that, that's what I always think, because I've got like over here this little image. But if we look, it's because of all these things that World War One itself never resolves. We see a huge casualty rate, massive fighting, complete changing of the borders of Europe, but none of the long-standing problems are actually addressed. And that, coupled with what happens at the end of the First World War, paves the way for power vacuums in Germany, in Italy, and even in Japan. And that will be what leads the world into another world war. If we look at World War I, okay, by August 1914, the little pissing contest between Austria-Hungary and Serbia blows up into a full-scale global conflict. Okay, just in very brief, okay? You probably had class, about this before if you remember from one of my classes if you've had me before. But what happens is, Gavrilo Princip shoots, he's a Serbian nationalist, he shoots Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the Austrian throne. Okay, so now Austria-Hungary wants, reparations from Serbia. And in fact, they're going to declare war on July the 28th, 1914. And that triggers a really screwed up alliance system. Because what we're going to see is Russia has an alliance with Serbia. So Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Well, Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary. They declare war on Russia. Well, France has an alliance with Russia, so they declare war on Germany. And then Britain has kind of a on-again, off-again sort of secret alliance with France. They wanted this thing so bad, they dig up a treaty from 1830 guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, Belgian independence. And so they declare war on Germany. Now, if we want to look at what's going on, part of why this happens is, and bear in mind, the First World War is one hell of a family spat. I mean, I hate my in-laws. My mother-in-law has tried to shoot me before. It's totally fine. These things happen. Word to the wise: if your mother-in-law asks you to show her how to shoot a gun, don't do it. It will be used against you. She didn't actually shoot me. She just, nothing like pointing a gun at me, gangster style, finger on the trigger, and crazy in-laws. Anywho, but George the V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia are all cousins. This is a huge family squabble. But the problem is these nations have been competing for years. Germany wants its place in the sun. Okay, Germany and Britain have had this huge imperialistic feud since at least the 1860s, 1870s. Okay, there's the problem of empire. People had forgotten what war was like. People had been used to a war being like 6 weeks in the case of, the Austro-Prussian War, or about 6 months in the case of the Franco-Prussian War, or being far off in Africa in the case of, say, the Anglo-Zulu War. People had not fought a total war in Europe, okay, since 1815, since Napoleon. And so people were once again thinking that warfare was great, warfare was fun. Men, this is how you proved your worth if you wanted to date a woman. Ladies, you would not date a man who had not been in the military, who had not gone to war. War was seen as something fun. But World War I, it's going to take all of those problems and not really address any of them. It's going to redraw the boundaries of Europe, but that's just going to create a lot of new problems. And World War I gives us a taste of what's to come, because we see new industrialized warfare. Things like HMS Dreadnought, which spurs an arms race in 1906. This is yet another cause of the First World War. And the Dreadnought, the world's first all-big gun battleship with 10 12-inch guns firing a broadside of 8 12-inch guns, 12 being the diameter of the gun. 12-inch guns. This thing had double the firepower of any previous battleship. It was also about 5 miles an hour faster. This thing made all navies obsolete like that. We're also going to see, new quick-firing artillery, or, like this Krupp 77mm field gun, artillery that can now shoot, miles and miles and miles away. Indirect fire, it can fire over troops. So unlike the old school black powder cannon, these things don't have to be on the gun line. And we're going to see the mass adoption of machine guns. And I don't mean big Gatling guns, which are kind of like artillery pieces, but man-portable. Yeah, they're going to weigh about 20, 25 pounds, but one guy can lug this thing across the battlefield. We're now going to see firing rates of 300 to 500 rounds per minute. Okay, and this completely changes war. And the fact is, nobody knows how to fight it. Okay, and why I'm spending time on the fighting is understand the German Blitzkrieg tactics, the, lightning war. Which, funny story, Blitzkrieg is actually not a German term. It was coined by an American reporter with the invasion of Poland. But the actual tactics, the combined arms tactics of, using tanks, mechanized infantry, dive bombers, all that, it's born out of World War I. Because with World War I, nobody knows how to fight machine guns, artillery, things like that. So it devolves into what we call the race to the sea. A line of trenches. Sorry, I mirrored thing. A line of trenches like this. From Switzerland down here to the North Sea up here. Historically, generals had trained to flank the enemy. Okay, if here's your battle line, you don't frontal assault, you go around the flank. Okay, that's what you do. But with trenches all along, you can't do that. So we see things like going over the top. What's going on here? The cliche thing of the guy blowing the whistle, you get up, jump out of no man's land, run to the enemy trench. It's horrendous. It causes a lot of casualties. It's ineffective. And so we see the war stalemates from December 1914 until about September 1918. The war will stalemate. To put it in perspective, okay, the front line of the Western Front will move approximately 30 miles in that time. And I don't mean like 30 miles one way. It will move 30 miles this way, then this way, and this way. To put that in perspective, for those of you who are, OSU students, well, I guess you're all OSU students, but actually here, the front line will move roughly half the distance, actually less than half the distance, between Stillwater and Tulsa, okay? Stillwater to Tulsa. We will move half that distance in 4 years. The fighting is just absolutely brutal. There we go, now I get the point. And because of that, because of trench warfare, we see that warfare now starts to get ugly, okay? I understand anybody who's been in war is going to tell you how bad it is. But historically, let's look before World War I. Okay, the bright blue uniforms, the bright red uniforms, the awesome caps, the military music, all this. Warfare was this grand, awesome thing, so it would seem. But now we're going to have big, huge tanks to break the stalemate. We're going to have aircraft. We're going to have machine guns, flamethrowers. We're going to do all of this stuff to try. This is the epitome of what, was it Will Rogers said, that you can't say that mankind never advances. In every new war, they find a new way to kill you. This is the epitome of that. Because now it's this whole idea to try to break the stalemate. And the losses are going to be absolutely just insane. If we look at 1916, in 3 offensives, the German Verdun offensive, the British Somme offensive, and the Russian Brusilov offensive, 4.25 million casualties in those 3 offensives alone. 4.25 million. All right, we live in an era where, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan. I don't even know the numbers, but if it's 10,000 or less, I would be surprised. And that's for a 10-year period. 4.25 million in 1 year. Now, that's obviously not dead, But you're actually looking at about 1.5 million troops dead, 4.25 million casualties. To put this in some other perspectives, more British troops will be wounded in 1918 than the entirety of the Second World War. That is how bad this is. If we look at American casualties, okay, what is it? 26,622, I believe, killed in action in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. One half of all American combat deaths in one battle in September to November 1918. That represents, I figured it out once, but something like 1/1000th of a percent of the entire American population. Quite literally, there was no way you could be in the United States and not know somebody who died in this battle. That is how bad it is. And so what we see, why this is also important, is with World War I, we don't really see that much innovation. Sure, you've got tanks, but nothing, tanks are there for infantry support. Sure, you have aircraft, and aircraft are probably the biggest change. Aircraft, there have been some historians who have probably rightly suggested that without the First World War, or rather, to put it another way, the First World War advanced aircraft technology by about 30 years in a 4-year period. We go from, 11 years since the Wright Flyer. We go from small single-engine planes to two and even, I think, 4-engine massive bombers. We can do this. But we don't know how to use them. Machine guns, we don't fully know how to use it. Flamethrowers, we understand how to use it, but it's this idea, how do we prevent this from happening again? And so, not next lecture, but in probably our third lecture this week, I'll spend some time talking about how the Second World War, early on, especially for most nations, but especially Germany, it was designed to try to circumvent all this, designed to try to ensure that this never happened again. Because although at the time people are saying the First World War is the war to end all wars, military people knew that was stupid. Military people knew you cannot end war. So they're always plotting the next war, and for them it was, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? 4.25 million casualties in 1 year is outright insane. Now, if this war had changed anything, we could maybe put a happy face on it. But the fact is, World War I is humanity trying to kill itself. And the reason I say that is the war is simply going to end in an armistice. And all an armistice means is that, if you and I are fighting, we have an armistice. You put down your guns, I put down mine. We don't even necessarily end the war. We just say we're going to stop fighting. If you look at it today, North and South Korea, the Korean War, 1950 to 53, has technically never ended. They only signed an armistice. They've never actually made a formal peace. But here, this is, the German delegation signing the armistice, in Paris. And what we're going to see is with the armistice of November 11, 1918, okay, they do this because, they are just simply exhausted. Both sides have fought themselves to a standstill. Now, the German army is worse off, okay? Industrially, they can't keep up. Militarily, they can't keep up. By 1918, they're drafting the graduating class of 1920 into the ranks. You've got 15 and 16-year-old kids fighting in the front line. But let's look on the French perspective. The French had seen a mutiny in 1916. The British were literally running out of men. The United States, we have got more men, our guys are fresher, but industrially, we can't do anything until about 1920. And so everybody agrees to an armistice, in part because of Wilson's 14 points. And if you remember the 14 points from your survey classes, that's where Wilson called for things such as, League of Nations, no secret treaties, open borders, freedom of the seas, stuff like that. The Germans agree to this. But once you have an armistice, then you have to deal with an actual peace. We also see that in 1918, remember, you've got the Russian Revolution in late 1917, but in 1918, the Bolsheviks seize power and drop Russia out of the war. The Germans, similarly, are facing revolution at home. So it's the case of, especially with the Germans, understand this, and this is especially key when we, want to superimpose World War II. When you think of a naval blockade in a world war, we tend to think of the Deutsche U-Boot, the German submarine. And that's definitely true for both conflicts, but the British in World War I enacted a naval blockade as well, and theirs was much more effective. By 1918, the average German is starving. They're not getting raw materials. They're not able to make food, make weapons. And so the German army is crumbling on the front line. The citizenry is failing at home, where everything is ripe for revolution. And by, I believe it's November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II has abdicated. So now there's a hole in the government. And so this is going to lead us to the Treaty of Versailles. And why this is important is, understand, although German officers told their troops, we are voluntarily terminating the war. We are ending the war to avoid further bloodshed. All this stuff to make it seem like they hadn't lost. In reality, Germany was soundly defeated. And so what we're going to see with Versailles, which, these are going to be the architects of Versailles. David Lloyd George here on the right, Woodrow Wilson in the center, and Georges Clemenceau on the left. With Versailles, and why this Versailles is so important, is Versailles is probably the start of the Second World War. Because what we're going to see, and not only just the start of the Second World War, but the start of a lot of stuff. We're going to see there's going to be harsh peace terms. Germany has to sign Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. And this specifically says that the Germans agree to accept the blame for the war. What that means is, even though Austria-Hungary started the conflict, Germany has to accept the blame. And because of that, we're going to see huge war reparations. Germany is going to be disarmed. All of this stuff, the 14 points, were used simply to bring the Germans to the negotiating table. Once that was done, once that's done, the Allied powers, specifically Britain and France, said to hell with them. They liked a couple of things, but Wilson was largely told, go pound sand. And so what we're going to see is, although with the 14 points we get the League of Nations, realistically what happens is the Allies seek to punish Germany. We'll get into that here in just a second, the punishments. But understand, it's because of these punishments that what we're going to see is that Germany is going to be absolutely devastated. Then that devastation, economic indemnities, a Great Depression, a power vacuum leads to guys with, screwed up little mustaches taking power. Now, unfortunately, I wish I could say that's all Versailles did. But there's one other screw up for the United States, and we have to deal with this guy. His name is Ho Chi Minh. He was part of the Vietnamese delegation because Vietnam at this time was called Indochina, and so Indochina sent some representatives with France because obviously they're a French colony. And one of the things that Wilson, was pushing as part of his 14 points was the right of self-determination. We see that here with, Versailles creates all of these new countries. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. We see, Austria-Hungary split. And with self-determination was the idea that Czechs should not be subsumed. They should get their own country. The Poles should get their own country. The Hungarians should get their own country. All the Slavic peoples should be united. And this guy, Ho Chi Minh, says he liked that idea. He wanted the same. He wanted an independent Vietnam. But Wilson, through an interpreter, more or less said, no, you're Asian. We don't care about Asians. This is only for Europeans. Understand, Wilson may be an idealist, but he's still a racist bastard and a product of his time. And as such, he's unwilling to do anything to help. Especially, he doesn't want to trigger a fall of empire. So this guy, rebuffed by the United States, further ticked off in the 1950s, is going to go to the Soviet Union, going to go get military aid. Boom, here's how we start the Vietnam War. The seeds for that are laid in 1919. So Versailles, it's this huge, earth-shattering type thing, as we can kind of see all these nations get their own stuff. The League of Nations is going to control some stuff. And then if you look here at the Rhineland and what looks like kind of somebody pooped on the map, it's an occupied area. The French are going to occupy part of Germany. And so if we look just from these harsh reparations, especially militarily, this creates a narrative the Nazis can then later use. We're going to see the Rhineland will be occupied. This is the industrial heart of Germany. If this is occupied by the French, who obviously need it because half their country has been destroyed, then this is going to mean the Germans really can't do anything. We're going to see the German Luftstreitkräfte. The Air Force is going to be disbanded. I know I said Luftstreitkräfte. The Luftwaffe is the post-Nazi thing. So, just for the record, I'm not pulling terms out of my butt. It's going to be disbanded. They're not allowed to have planes of any sort. The German Navy, reduced in size and effective firepower. The German Navy is limited. If you remember HMS Dreadnought from, the first couple slides. The German Navy, their battleships are limited to the Deutschland and Brandenburg classes. These are old school pre-dreadnoughts, maximum speed about 18 nautical miles an hour, firepower, 4 11-inch guns. These things can be blown out of the water by anything anybody else has. The German Navy is to be interned at Scapa Flow, or actually it has been interned since the end of the war. They're probably going to be cut up for prizes. Hey, okay, America, here's a dreadnought for you. France, here's like 5 dreadnoughts for you to do whatever, stuff like that. Well, the German Navy, on June the 21st, 1919, scuttles itself. Now, the Allies actually secretly liked this because it prevented any sort of, inter-allied competition. But what this also means is understand, the joke about Prussia, which will become Germany in 1871, was that this is not a state with an army, but an army with a state. Germany had been probably the preeminent military power in Europe. It had the most well-trained army, probably the second or third biggest army. Its navy was the second biggest navy in the world. And overnight, and it had one of the best air forces in the world. Overnight, the Air Force is gone. The Navy is gone. The German Army, limited to 100,000 men in 10 divisions. That seems like a lot. But 10 divisions, we've just come off a war with 10 divisions is like 2 corps. Okay, this is a drop in the bucket compared to what they used to have. So, out of that, the treaties also specifically state they can't build tanks. They can't build aircraft. They can't build submarines. They can't have super heavy artillery. They also have to pay a stupid amount of money. They are now indebted to the Allied powers. And what all of this does is destroy German pride, destroy the German economy, and create souring, just grumpy, just anger and deep-seated hatred. To put it in perspective, okay, this is a cartoon from about 1921. Perhaps it would gee up better if we let it touch Earth. Okay, this idea, by putting so much stuff on Germany can't rebuild. Germany is a smoking crater in the ground with a massive power vacuum, and somebody is going to come along and take advantage of it, and Hitler will. It's so bad that Ferdinand Foch, he was the commander of the Allied armies on the Western Front in World War I, the supreme commander. On the day Versailles was signed, June 28, 1919, Foch said, "My God, this is not peace. This is an armistice for 20 years. 20 years, 1 month, and 3 days later, Germany invaded Poland. He was off by 1 month and 3 days. Versailles starts the path to the Second World War, because Versailles so renders Germany helpless. Okay, just cast them out. We'll talk about that with the League of Nations in a second. That when you got a guy like Adolf Hitler, and I hope you kind of see this, because I hope you did. Well, and if you've not, please do, because I'll work it into the essay question somehow. But watch the first part of Hitler's SS Portrait of Evil. When you're bankrupt, when you went from, let's say it's 1932. When you went from 20 years ago, you're demanding, as Kaiser Wilhelm said, the place in the sun. You are a nation like everyone else. You want a place in the sun. When you go from that to you're unemployed, you're starving, your economy's in the toilet, you have no, political power, and then you have a guy coming along saying, "We will make Germany great again. Vote for me and the Nazis, and we will make Germany great again." You're bound to do it because that's I'm not saying Donald Trump's a Nazi, okay? The hair's too bad to be a Nazi. But when he comes through saying his stuff, "Make America great again," even though he's not telling you how, it's because he's hearkening back to what we were, what he perceives we used to be. And so it's this idea that if and it's a common political thing, make us how we used to be. But see, here you can't really say that America's not great today. But look at 1932 Germany. Germany is clearly, by every standard you can imagine, inferior to what it had been not 20 years earlier. So what we're going to see is, Versailles, the whole point of Versailles, honestly, was to ensure that Germany couldn't do this again. But it went too far. We also have to deal with, at the same time, just kind of this everything falling out of World War I, the fact that, in the Soviet Union, there is a Soviet Union now. Red October. The new, with the initial Menshevik Revolution in 1917, the Kerensky government wanted to remain neutral to the Allied powers. Kerensky himself said, look, if we drop out of the war, okay, nobody will have anything to do with Russia ever again. But the Bolsheviks are going to seize power. The Germans will even help Vladimir Lenin because they need Russia to drop out so they can move troops to the Western Front. And so in November 1917, we're going to see a communist revolution. It's the, in the old calendar the Russians were still using because they don't play well with others. It's in October, but the Bolsheviks seize power. And what happens is, Brest-Litovsk, March the 3rd, 1918, they drop out of World War I. In July, the Bolsheviks shoot the Tsar and his whole family. And then in 1919, Red Russia, and I say Red Russia because we're not quite to the Soviet Union just yet, sponsors the Third International of the Comintern, International Communism. They want an international Soviet Republic. They're saying from the get-go that for a communist state to work, everybody has to be communist. Why this is important, okay, is rather than, Germany being the bad guy and you having this cemented alliance, United States, Britain, France, and Russia, that alliance system starts falling apart immediately. And this whole notion of the war to end all wars falls apart when the Russian Civil War breaks out. When the Allies start sending troops over to Russia, it just, this idea that World War I was going to change things dies fairly quickly. If we look at just some of the, we're going to understand there's a Red Scare going on in the United States. We're afraid that, Russian immigrants are going to come over and bring communism. Or that if you're a labor guy and you want to strike for better wages, well, if you strike for wages, that's going to lead to disorder and riots, and then we're going to see Bolshevism, murders, and then, you're going to bring everything down. So how dare you want $15 an hour at McDonald's? How dare you? You're going to lead to communism. Okay, not really, but so goes the logic. Or my favorite, we'll never change the blue and white to red. I got, guys, there's red on the flag already, just saying. But people became absolutely paranoid. Now, why the Russian Civil War is important is, one, it's yet another bloody war. It defeats this narrative that World War I was the war to end all wars. And also, we're going to see the Chinese in Manchuria. And that is going to start to trigger a desire for an East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which will lead to eventual conflict in the Pacific. They're going to be fighting from 1918 to 1924. And if we look at the Civil War, it's divided between the Reds and the Whites. The Reds are the communists. The Whites are the pro-Tsarist Russians. And we're going to see that by 1918, communists in Russia were very, very, very brutal. Repression, political murder. If you did anything they didn't like, they would just shoot you. I'm going to say fighting is going to range all over from the Caucasus and, European Russia all the way to Siberia. And this is going to be absolutely bloody. Roughly around 2.7 million casualties. And at the same time, Red Russia, which we could call the Soviet Union, is fighting a war with, the newly created state of Poland. Why all this is, why this is important is we see stuff in Siberia, we'll talk about in a second, as well as Russia is, in part because of how it was with the Tsar, because the autocracy quite literally sucked. But that coupled with, sorry, I just lost my train of thought, this stupid cold. The autocracy, had left Russia in shambles, coupled with this war, coupled with the Soviets trying to get on their feet, that it's going, this is building up the narrative that Hitler will use in 1941. When he says to invade Russia, all you have to do is kick in the door, and the whole structure will come crumbling down. Everything is building all the way from the 19 teens and 1920s on into the Second World War. I also realize I'm doing all these hand movements down here, like playing a piano look like, but you can't see anything. Rawr. Okay. So, if we look, some of the things we're seeing during the Civil War, okay, a lot of it, Red Army troops, we're starting to use armored cars, okay, because armored cars had started to come in use along with tanks in World War I. Those are starting to gain more appeal. We're starting to, create new doctrines that people will eventually, use in the Second World War. Also, just to throw him up here, Admiral Kolchak, who is the White Russian commander until he's caught with his mistress and executed. Oops. But now to tick off the Soviets, because understand that whole alliance system has crumbled. The Allies immediately send expeditions to Russia. Quite literally, for many Americans, in about October 1918, they're on ships to France. Suddenly they realize it takes a long time to get to France. Boom, they're dropped in Russia. Or there's a case of at least a couple. They're at sea November 11. It comes through, the war's over. They feel the ship change course. They're like, yes, we're going home. Boom, drops them in Arkhangelsk. We're going to send troops to Siberia as well. We're going to send naval stuff through the Dardanelles to the Black Sea. And so what we're going to see is for the Allies, the idea was to save the country. And the reason for that is, understand, Britain was still a monarchy. France and Italy were afraid of communism. And so if the communists could take full hold, then what was to stop that, international Soviet republic? But the fact is, not everybody wants to fight. It's done, really poorly. And so what we're going to see is by 1921, the Allies are pulled out. Let the Russians handle it on their own. For us, why this is important for a Cold War perspective is, these are American troops in Arkhangelsk. We like to forget this happened. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, giving a speech to General Secretary Gorbachev, said, Mr. Gorbachev, why, our two peoples have never fought each other. Why do we have this sense of distrust? Let's try to ease relations. And Gorbachev responded in a televised address, the American people may not remember, but we do remember, Mr. President. The Russians remember this. So the Soviets feel ostracized. The Germans have been ostracized. Consider this. In the wake of Versailles, we'll talk about this a bit more, if not this lecture, the next one. The Germans and the Soviets, with no one else to turn to, have to cooperate. Never mind they're going to be the biggest of enemies in the 1940s. The Germans get tank experience by sending people to Russia to build tanks for the Russians and then, obviously learning how to do it. In Asia, the Chinese will, or not, sorry, not the Chinese, the Japanese will send troops to Russia and Manchuria, but they keep theirs there for the longest of time. And in fact, understand Japan and Russia had fought the Russo-Japanese War back in 1904. The Japanese have Korea since 1910. They've already fought Manchuria once, but now this gives them the pretext where they are sort of desirous to possibly try to expand, if not into Manchuria, then into China. And that's going to trigger a series of conflicts starting in 1931, 10 years after this, that will help to lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Now, the one thing that does come out of this is, positive or not, and honestly mostly not, is the League of Nations. Now, this is like a more ineffective UN. I mean, if you imagine, find Hans Blix telling, Kim Jong-un, show me your weapons or else. Or else what? Or else we will write you a letter telling you how very, very angry we are. Okay, that's bold for the League of Nations. The League could not even do that. The hope for the League of Nations was that this would somehow prevent another massive war from ever occurring. People were terrified that World War I was not a fluke. And I mean, indeed it wasn't, as we now know. They thought, let's have a forum where everybody can get together, discuss their problems, try to find a way out of war. But it's inherently weak. There's no military authority. They can't raise an army. The UN can at least do peacekeepers. There's no legal authority. If the UN or if the League says, Italy, you guys are a-holes for invading Ethiopia, there's nothing binding. But more than that, the United States refused to join. Okay? So we're kind of the linchpin because we are now the military-industrial power that made World War I end in 1918 with an Allied victory. Okay? This League of Nations bridge, designed by the President of the United States, this is Wilson's idea, and he won't do it. So there's that. Then there's the issue that Germany and the Soviet Union are barred. Eventually, the late 20s, early 30s, both will be allowed to join, but they are barred from entering. So, just to recap for the fact that people in the 1920s are dumbasses, we need to protect from another war because Germany might want another war, but we're not going to let the Germans in. We don't like the Soviets. We want to protect from increasing Soviet power, so we're not going to let the Soviets in so we can stop a war. This is doomed to fail at the beginning. It's like, come on, guys, you had one job. How did you screw it up? This is doomed to fail, and nobody cares to see it. Why do we not, jump in? Because we're afraid that the League is somehow going to tie the hands of the United States. That if the League... Well, let's look at a UN thing. What is it? There's a UN gun treaty, apparently. I am an NRA member, so I get all this stupid spam emails. Jeez, I'm mostly there for the gun insurance, but come on, I do World War II history because I collect World War II guns. And, come on, I collect, it's like this that I was going to show, German World War II bayonet, which we'll talk about when we get to rearmament. Go ahead and do it now. Because the Germans had to code this specifically. I don't know if you can see the S/173G. Why? Because according to the Treaty of Versailles, they're not supposed to have this. So they have to try to pretend that they don't have it. But what is it? The gun treaty, the idea that, if the UN were to ban weapons, that it would expect its member states to do it, or some bull crap. I don't know. It goes to my junk mail anyway. That's what we're afraid of. That, if the League of Nations says they want to do something, does that trump the sovereignty of the United States Congress? That's the linchpin. So we don't join in. We don't do it. But because of that, the League now has no real bite. And so the League is not there to actually solve any problems. It does some charity work. It does great relief work. But it's a complete and abject failure when it comes to its intended goal of preventing another world war. So that's, what's going on in Germany. That's what's going on, internationally. But then there's kind of just a surprise thing. And that's in Italy. Because with Italy, understand, the Italians were on the winning side. They were on the Central Powers side. They were an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they wisely said, no, we'll stay neutral. And then Britain and France bribed them, saying, if you guys go to war on our side, we'll give you part of Austria. Yeah, we hate Austria. Let's do this. Why not? But it had been a disaster because the Italian army was inept. It was, its leaders were stupid. There's going to be, 12 battles of the Isonzo where they were literally attacked the same place over and over and over again. They'll see around 650,000 war deaths. There's also class conflict because the peasant classes get more and more resentful of, that officer class which comes from the nobility. And again, they see, look, well, you guys were safe. We're the ones who fought and died. And so we're going to see a rise of socialist party movements. And this is how, guys like Benito Mussolini are going to be able to come in. Because socialist party, but also out of that comes the fascist party. Also understand, Italy is poor compared to everybody else. They don't have the wealth of France. They don't have the wealth of Britain. They're not able to share in the victory as much. And so because of that, we're going to see that, okay, Germany, obviously, quote-unquote, the bad guys of World War I. Okay, you can understand World War I. Japan was a member of the Allied powers, but they then get desirous of conquest. And here with Italy, what happens is the post-World War I crisis lets a guy like Mussolini take power, and then Mussolini decides, okay, well, I can't fix the country. Wars are good distractions. Boom. And at the same time, as we're getting these ideas of territorial ambitions, we can kind of see this idea of what we're going to call never again. I'm going to be referring to this a lot this week because World War I, remember, had been seen as the war to end all wars, but warfare keeps going. People are afraid of large-scale industrial warfare. Again, we had seen what happened, 20-some million people dead, 4 years of war, and nothing. And so the growing philosophy among the victors was that this can never happen again. And so what's going to happen are things with the best of intentions that continue to lead to World War II. There becomes a growing desire for military disarmament, especially in the realm of navies. Because what had happened, remember HMS Dreadnought, when she was built, all the big nations immediately start wanting their own dreadnoughts. And so what we're going to see is overnight, Britain's going to build 30. We're going to build, about 20. Germany's going to build around 20. Japan's going to build around 6. France is going to build about a half dozen. I mean, everybody just builds this stuff. And you build all this stuff, and it just creates power and tension. So there's that we'll talk about in just a second. There's also the fear of fighting. And this is going to be the huge problem, especially once we get to the 1930s. The desire that's like, look, yeah, we know Hitler's an asshole, but is it worth a world war to stop him? And so what happens, this fear of fighting, okay, I would say this is the main ideological cause of the Second World War, in the sense of Hitler could have been stopped at any number of times. But time and again, we see the Western Allies and even the Soviet Union not wanting to risk war. And what we're going to see is a chain of events that, just to flash forward, if Germany, breaks the Versailles Treaty with the Rhineland and nothing happens, then they learned, well, let's break it by, the Anschluss in Austria. Nothing happens. Let's break it by, wanting part of Czechoslovakia. Well, nothing happens. Let's break it by rearmament. Nothing happens. Let's break it by invading Poland, and oh God, why are we in a war? It's totally unexpected. That's why I say this philosophy. But we can see the very first manifestation of it in the Washington Naval Conference, because after the war, on the one hand, Navy, nations can't really support these huge battle fleets anymore. But it's also fear, it's like, let's get rid of weapons. A farewell to arms, basically. If we get rid of the guns, maybe we won't have as much war. But I mean, if we look the size of the British fleet, I mean, here we can see one. Where's my mouse? There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 dreadnoughts. Each one of these, on average, a broadside of 10, 13.5-inch guns. I mean, this is a huge financial commitment. Or compared to that, in the 1920s, we'll see the American battle fleet. So here we only see, what, 1, 2, 3, we only see 6 dreadnoughts. But I mean, these are what would have been called super dreadnoughts. They're even better. 16-inch guns, some 14-inch. But what we're going to see is, this costs a lot of money. So the thought becomes, what about naval disarmament? And out of that, we get the Washington Naval Conference of 1922. And the whole point is to try to limit the size of naval power, in theory. But it's also done to preserve American and British hegemony, in the sense of, we want to prevent the naval arms race, but we don't want to be equal. So what the conference does is they create a ratio, the 5-5-3-3-3 ratio, where what they say is for every 5 American or British battleships, okay, the French, the Japanese, and I've got on here BR, I never fixed that, so that should be IT. So for every 5 American or British battleships, the Italians, the French, and the Japanese could have 3. Now, the idea is, so if we have 10, the Japanese get 6. If we have 15, they get 9. The idea is to limit how much is going to be built. We're going to create limits on the size of ships, size of guns. We're going to say that battleships can only be about 35,000 tons. They can only have 16-inch guns. And then you can finish some construction underway, but then we have to have a 10-year holiday that you can't build new stuff until the 1930s. Now, why this is important is, on the one hand, it seems like naval disarmament, but it creates a problem, twofold. One, the Japanese don't like it. The Japanese see it as inherently racist. Why do they have to give up their stuff? Why are they not allowed the same as America and Britain? If we look, sorry I didn't prep, but the Japanese, so at this time, when we're saying battleships now because most nations are getting rid of their old pre-dreadnoughts, but a pre-dreadnought and a dreadnought are both technically battleships. The Japanese would have what? 2 Fuso class, 2 Issei class, so they would have, and the 2 Nagato class, so 6 battleships, 4 battle cruisers, okay? But they're building, at this time, another 4 battle cruisers and 2 to 3 more battleships, okay? And the thing is, doing this, it let Britain and America meet these treaty, obligations by getting rid of our old crap. But it ensured that the Japanese would have to get rid of their new stuff. Okay, we have to scrap some new stuff, Britain has to scrap new stuff, but it hits the Japanese pretty hard. And this creates a sense already of competition. A sense that the white European powers want to keep the Asian powers behind militarily. Now, others like Italy and France might be bummed they don't get their new play toys. But they love it because financially they cannot afford them. So they're like, okay, fine. Hey, it sucks. We're grumpy, but oh, thank God we don't have to declare bankruptcy. The other issue, and by the way, this is signed February 8, 1922. The other issue is this inadvertently paves the way for the aircraft carrier to become the centerpiece of naval technology. And why that happens is at this time, carriers were seen as, you put planes on them, they're there for fleet defense, or they're there for scouting. But the Japanese see this and say, okay, well, nobody cares about carriers. And quite literally, you could tell, based on the tonnages, that nobody really cared about carriers. The Japanese say, okay, well, let's put our stuff into carriers, and let's see if we can use that to our advantage. And so the Japanese will build the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, the Hosho, in about 1920. She was already under construction, but we'll finish her in 1922. Just as, Britain will convert 2 of its, the Courageous and Glorious were called large light cruisers, but they're battle cruisers, for lack of a better term. Convert 2 of those. The French will convert a battleship, will convert 2 battle cruisers, Lexington, Saratoga. The Japanese will also convert 2, the Akagi and the Kaga. And why this is important is where everyone else misuses carriers, because they are relegated to an inferior position on battleships, the Japanese will embark on, trying to figure out how they can use aircraft carriers to their advantage. And in doing so, what this means is by 1941, spoiler alert, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor with aircraft carriers. The Japanese have advanced carrier aviation far in excess of anyone else on the planet. So that's what's going on, kind of in a military thing. This idea again, never, fallout from World War One. Let's try to move away from war. And what I'd like to do now is just briefly touch on what's going on in Germany, because obviously Germany is the focal point of this. If Japan had just embarked on its conquest, you might have seen a Pacific War between Japan and the United States, but it wouldn't most certainly not have been a world war. It's really Germany that makes this a world war. We see in Berlin lots of military raids. Military, not raids, but parades. We're going to see the creation of the Freikorps. These are groups of more or less veteran vigilantes going through, fighting it out with the communists because, they don't want a communist insurrection. We're going to see in October 1918, sailors' revolt. The German Hochseeflotte, the High Seas Fleet, is more or less going to mutiny at anchor because they don't want to go. The Germans try to say, okay, let's have the fleet sortie in one last battle. And the sailors more are like, ha ha ha, no. So that's where it really starts. But then it simmers that in August 1919, huge rebellion. So you have the Freikorps and the German government fighting it out with the communists. Now the communists get political gains, but the Germans, the SPD, the People's Socialist Party, the Social Democrats basically, they refuse to work with them because they say, look, we want a different kind of government. We don't want a Kaiser. We don't want an authoritarian government. But we most certainly don't want you either. And what we're going to see is throughout the 1920s, there's going to be small-scale coups. There's going to be assassinations. Germany is in turmoil. And out of this, we get, through these revolutions, the idea of the stab in the back. And what the stab in the back myth is that Germany was winning militarily in World War I, but they were stabbed in the back at home. That people like the communists, people like the Jews, who did not support the war, underwent revolution and undermined the military troops at home. That's not exactly what happened at all. That's really conflating a bunch of events. But this myth just grows and grows and grows. And this myth is what the Nazis are going to pervert into tapping in to that latent European anti-Semitism that has been there realistically since the time of the Crusades. So Germany is majorly unstable. And the communist insurrection, they're crushed by the Freikorps. And understand, the Freikorps are not sanctioned by the government. Much like the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, of Nazi fame, they're paramilitary forces. It's you and your buds getting together saying we're going to go drink beer and shoot commies. That's basically what it is. That also sounds like a bad American movie from the 50s, but whatever. Now, German veterans are going to flock to Freikorps, free military, basically, free military corps. Because, understand, in the German system, you had a huge standing army. You're now cut to 100,000 men. All those guys got to go somewhere. There's rampant unemployment in Germany. So here, it's something they knew how to do. Many of them are hard right conservative, and many hated the communists. It just seemed like a natural thing. Now they're going to roam the countryside. They're going to kill suspected communists. The law doesn't stop them. And the government doesn't stop them because the government likes what they're doing. Because this helps to ensure the communists aren't going to get a foothold. It's not nice, but why this is so important is, again, hopefully you watch that video, but if you see like how the brown shirts, the SA, are going around beating people up, doing what they can to get votes, intimidation, the precedent for that is set in these Deutsche Freikorps. And it's in this background that a young ex-Bohemian Gefreiter, a corporal from Bohemia, Adolf Hitler, becomes head of the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeitspartei, the German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, better known as the Nationalsozialisten, or the Nazis. And it's out of here that on the nights of November 8 to 9, 1923, he and the Nazis are going to stage the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. and this is a coup to try to take over the government. Now, it fails. Hitler's going to be jailed in Landsberg prison. This is where he writes Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And then what's got to be the dumbest thing in history, he's released the next year. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe I play games like Civilization 5 too long. When people rebel against me, I don't put them in jail with a slap on the wrist and release them in 6 months for good behavior. They kind of go to the gallows. That's just what I'm thinking. But here, it's clearly a world apart. And in part, we can see it because if we look at Hitler, already right here sporting, the mustache, we're going to see he carried the favor of guys like General Ludendorff. Ludendorff was one of the 2 co-commanders in World War I. Understand this putsch, okay? In World War I, the German army from 1916 was headed by, Hans Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg. Ludendorff is going to be a beer hall putsch conspirator. Hindenburg is going to be the president that appoints Hitler. That's how they can get away with this, because they're seen not as these, upstart kooks, these crazy reactionaries, but they're seen as part of this, old clique of Germans who quite literally want to make Germany great again. And that's how they can get away with it. That's how Hitler can be imprisoned for a short time and then released, and nothing bad happens. In fact, people are quite literally stupid. Don't believe what you read. This is from December 20, 1924, from the New York Times. Adolf Hitler, once the demigod of the reactionary extremists, released on parole from Landsberg. He looked a much sadder and wiser man. It is believed he will retire to private life and return to Austria, the place of his birth. Facepalm. Quite literally, the newspapers that dared to comment on Hitler at this time were saying that, this is the last we're ever going to hear of Hitler. That's it. No. The fact is, they could not have been further from the truth. And the reason is because Weimar Germany, and this is where we'll end off today, this is the government created in the wake of Versailles. And Weimar, if we want to date it, Weimar Germany, let's go 1919 to 1932. Weimar Germany, it's limited power, it is democratic, but it's ineffective. It's burdened by those war reparations. It doesn't have a big military. Its economy is in the toilet. I've got some good visual aids for that next time. Something, I don't understand, but the culture flourished. I had to read a book on it in graduate school about, yay art and stuff. But more to the point, it's politically unstable. You have all of these coups popping up. It can't contain guys like Hitler, who are wildly popular. It never has a strong government to be able to deal with these reactionaries. It sets the precedent of paramilitary forces when it doesn't stop things like the Freikorps. And more to the point, and this is both a failing of Weimar and a result of Versailles, it cannot deal with the issues of the Great Depression. The Great Depression all but destroys Weimar Germany, knocks open the door, and paves the way for a resurgent Nazi party. So on that less than happy note, we'll go ahead and call it good for today. We'll pick up next time talking about the rise of fascism in Italy, in Germany, and in Japan. And as always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I will answer you as quick as I can. Have a good one. Hopefully you guys are avoiding whatever plague is going around. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.